Diane Foster looked at the girl in seat 3A and felt something twist inside her chest. Not guilt, not shame, but something uglier than both. She didn't ask questions. She didn't check anything. She reached down, grabbed the child by the arm hard enough to leave marks, and yanked her out of that seat like she was removing something that didn't belong there. And when the girl stood up quietly, without a single word of protest, Diane's foot swung forward and drove into her shin with deliberate, vicious force. A young girl with a first-class ticket in her hand, and a flight attendant who had just made the worst mistake of her entire life. Because that little girl's father was about to freeze $800 million before the plane even landed. If this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. When Zoe Bennett boarded the flight from John F. Kennedy International Airport to Los Angeles, she was carrying exactly 3 things with her: a backpack filled with textbooks, a small silver bracelet on her left wrist that she never took off, and a grief so deep and so old that most days she forgot it was there until something reminded her. She was 13 years old. She had her mother's eyes, wide and dark and full of something that made adults uncomfortable when they looked too long. She had her father's posture, straight-backed, unhurried. The kind of stillness that comes not from passivity but from absolute certainty. She wore her hair in 2 braids that fell past her shoulders. She had noise-canceling headphones around her neck that she hadn't put on yet. And she was black in a first-class cabin, which apparently was enough. The gate agent had smiled at her when she boarded. The woman at the door had scanned her ticket and said, "Welcome aboard. Have a wonderful flight." Zoe had said, "Thank you." She had found seat 3A without any trouble, slid her backpack under the seat in front of her, and taken out the book she'd been reading for the past week, a biography of Thurgood Marshall that her father had recommended. She had been on page 147. She remembered that detail clearly because she never got to finish the chapter. She heard the footsteps before she saw the person. Sharp heels on the narrow aisle floor, a rhythm that was too quick, too deliberate, the kind of walk that someone does when they have already made up their mind before they arrive. Diane Foster was 41 years old, with 22 years in the industry, and she had a face that knew how to arrange itself into a smile when passengers were looking. But right then she was not smiling. She stopped at row 3 and looked at Zoe, the way someone looks at something that has been placed in the wrong drawer. "Excuse me," Diane said. Zoe looked up from her book. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Zoe did not flinch. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack, pulled out her boarding pass, and held it up. Diane looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Zoe, then back at the pass. "Where are your parents?" "My father is in Los Angeles," Zoe said. "I'm a solo minor." The gate agent was notified. "Right." Diane handed the pass back without looking at her. "You're going to need to move." The cabin had gone quiet in the way cabins go quiet when something uncomfortable is happening and everyone can feel it. But nobody wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Zoe kept her voice even. "My ticket is for 3A. "There's been a reassignment," Diane said. "We need this row for a passenger with special accommodations. No one told me at the gate." "I'm telling you now." There were 3 other passengers already seated in first class. A man in a gray suit reading a Wall Street Journal, a woman in her 50s with a laptop open, and a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with his phone already out and pointed in their direction, though he was doing his best to look like he wasn't recording. His name was Jamal Brooks, and later the world would come to know his name very well. Zoe closed her book slowly. She tucked it under her arm. She stood up, reached under the seat for her backpack, and slung it over one shoulder. She did all of this calmly, the way her father had taught her to move through situations that wanted to rattle her. Head up, shoulders back. Back. Don't give them your fear. And then Diane Foster moved to step aside in the narrow aisle. Except she didn't quite step aside. Her foot, whether by accident or design, and Zoe knew, she absolutely knew it was not by accident, swung forward and caught Zoe across the shin. The pain was sharp and sudden. Zoe gasped. Her knee buckled. She caught herself on the armrest of the seat beside her, and for a moment the world narrowed down to the hot throb of that impact and the burn of tears she refused to let fall. Diane did not apologize. She did not reach out to steady her. She stepped back and said, "Watch your step." Zoe looked at her. For just a second, she let Diane see everything she was feeling. Not the fear, not the pain. Something older than that. Something that had been passed down through generations of women who had been told to move, told they didn't belong, told to watch their step in spaces that were built for other people. Zoe let Diane see all of it. And then she closed her face like a door shutting quietly, and she walked toward the back of the plane. Jamal Brooks pressed record. She found her reassigned seat in row 27, middle seat, between a man who had already fallen asleep against the window and an elderly woman who smelled like lavender and looked at Zoe with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and fury on her behalf. The woman didn't say anything. She just reached over and patted Zoe's hand once. That almost broke her. Zoe set her backpack down. She pressed her fingers against her shin and hissed quietly at the tenderness. She would have a bruise by the time the plane landed. She knew that already. She sat back and closed her eyes and did the thing her father had taught her when everything felt like too much. She breathed in for 4 counts, held for 4, released for 4. In, hold, out. In, hold, out. She thought about her mother. Dr. Rachel Bennett had been the kind of woman who walked into rooms and immediately made people feel like the conversation had been waiting for her to start it. She had a laugh that started somewhere in her chest and spread outward like something unstoppable. She had spent 12 years of her career building something that most people in the aviation industry had dismissed as impossible, a system she called Ethos, a monitoring and response platform designed to identify, document, and act on bias inside airline operations. Not just bias in hiring or in training, bias in real time, in the air. Rachel had called it the most important work of her life. She said that tens of thousands of passengers every year experienced what Zoe had just experienced. The assumption of not belonging. The casual cruelty dressed up as procedure. And she had wanted to build something that could catch it, record it, name it, and make it impossible to deny. She had been killed in a freak storm over Lake Michigan. The official report called it weather-related. Her husband, David Bennett, had never believed that. He had never said so publicly, but Zoe had heard him on the phone late at night when he thought she was asleep saying things like, "It wasn't the weather," and "They knew what she was building," and "I need more time." What David had done since Rachel's death was not grieve. Or rather, he had grieved while also doing something else. He had taken every file, every line of code, every prototype server and data log that Rachel had left behind, and he had finished what she started. He had rebuilt Ethos from the ground up, made it faster and broader and more powerful than Rachel's original design. And he had embedded its activation into a single point of access, the bracelet he had placed on Zoe's wrist before she left for the airport. "You'll know when to use it," he had told her. His voice had been very quiet. "How will I know?" "Because you're your mother's daughter," he said. "And when the moment comes, you won't have to think about it. You'll just know." Zoe opened her eyes. She looked down at the bracelet. It was slim and silver with a small raised oval at the center that looked, to anyone who didn't know, like a simple piece of jewelry. There was no screen, no buttons, no indicator light, just a slight warmth against her skin that meant it was already passively connected, already listening, already waiting. She pressed the oval once, held it for 3 seconds, felt the faintest pulse against her palm like a heartbeat, and then stillness. Ethos was awake, in the cockpit, in the crew communication system, in the encrypted data channels running beneath the surface of the airline's onboard network. Something was now watching, not with hostility, with precision, with the methodical, tireless attention of a system designed by a woman who had believed to the very end that truth could be made undeniable if you only gave it the right tools. Back in Seat 3A, Diane Foster was serving champagne to the man in the gray suit who had not once looked up from his newspaper throughout the entire encounter with Zoe. She laughed at something he said. She touched the headrest of the seat beside him in a small proprietary way that meant she felt comfortable here at the front of the plane among people she recognized as belonging. She had no idea that the bracelet in row 27 had just begun pulling her personnel file. Jamal Brooks had stopped recording approximately 40 seconds after Zoe disappeared into the back cabin. He looked at his phone. He looked at the footage. 43 seconds of video that showed Diane ordering a child out of her seat, and then the unmistakable swing of a foot, and the sharp sound of impact, and the way Zoe's knee buckled, and Diane's voice saying, "Watch your step," and he felt something tighten in his chest. He was 19. He was pre-law at NYU. He had been flying home to see his family in Compton, and he had been upgraded to first class for the first time in his life. And he had felt briefly, absurdly, lucky. Now he felt something else. He opened his phone's cellular connection. They hadn't taken off yet. They were still at the gate. And he opened Instagram and he posted the video with a caption that read, "This just happened on my flight. The little girl's name is Zoe. She had a first-class ticket. She was kicked, literally. Watch to the end." Then he put his phone face down on his lap and looked out the window and thought about all the ways the next few hours might go, and whether any of them were going to be okay. The plane began to move. The world below them looked small and organized, the way it always does from up high, like someone had taken all the mess of human life and ironed it flat and color-coded it. Zoe watched it through the window over the sleeping man's shoulder. The elderly woman beside her had fallen asleep too, her lavender scent faint now, her breath slow and even. The cabin around Zoe was quiet. People had their headphones in, their tablets out, their eyes closed. She pressed her fingers against her shin again. Still tender. She would need ice. She did not go and ask Diane for ice. She thought about what her father had said when he explained Ethos to her, not the technical specifications. Those had gone over her head, though she understood the shape of it. What she remembered was what he said at the end when he was closing the laptop and the kitchen was getting dark, and he had that look on his face that meant he was thinking about Rachel. "Your mother didn't build this to punish anyone," he had said. She built it because she believed that systems only change when you make the problem impossible to look away from. She always said that bias survives in the dark, in the gray areas, in the well. We can't really prove it moments. She wanted to turn the lights on. Zoe had asked him, "What happens after the lights come on?" He had looked at her for a long time before he answered, "That depends on who's in the room." As the flight continued, Diane Foster walked down the aisle toward the back of the plane to check on the economy cabin. She was doing what she always did. That practiced professional smile. The small courtesies, the offer of water and pillows. She paused at row 27 without quite meaning to. She looked at the girl in the middle seat. Zoe was reading. She had her book open again. Thurgood Marshall, page 147. She did not look up. Diane stood there for a moment longer than made sense. Then she moved on. What she didn't see was the very slight way Zoe's hand moved to cover the bracelet. Not defensively, just carefully. The way you cover something valuable when someone gets too close. In the airline's executive monitoring center on the ground in Dallas, Texas, a system alert flagged on a screen that was usually blank. The person who saw it first was a junior data analyst named Amanda Lopez, who had been hired 8 months ago and who had never seen that particular alert category before because it had never been triggered before. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her supervisor. "There's something happening on Flight 247, she said. Her supervisor said, "What kind of something?" "I don't know how to describe it," Amanda said, "but it's pulling every bias-related incident report from the last 6 years. Every complaint, every flagged interaction, every case that was closed without resolution. It's pulling all of it and it's organizing it, cross-referencing, building something. I've never seen anything move this fast." Her supervisor went quiet for a moment. "Is this a breach?" "I don't think so," Amanda said slowly. "It's not breaking anything. It's not destroying data, it's reading it. I think it's building a case." Diane Foster at the front of the plane had no idea. Jamal Brooks in seat 2C had refreshed his Instagram 16 times in the past hour. The video had 40,000 views, then 60, then suddenly 300,000. His phone was buzzing so fast it was almost vibrating out of his pocket. He turned it to silent. He stared at the seat back in front of him and thought, okay, this is real. Zoe in seat 27B turned to page 148. The man in the gray suit in seat 3A was asleep now. His newspaper folded across his chest. The champagne glass beside him was empty. Diane walked past him on her way to the galley and paused to straighten his newspaper. A small, unconscious gesture of care for a passenger she recognized as her kind of passenger. The right kind. The kind who belonged in the front of the plane without anyone having to verify it. She did not know that Ethos had spent the time quietly and completely dismantling the lie, that she was simply a professional doing her job. The system had found 17 prior complaints against Diane Foster. 12 of them had been filed and closed within the same week, with notes in the system that used phrases like inconclusive evidence and no policy violation identified, and passenger declined further action. 3 of them had been escalated to the airline's internal equity board, which had been dissolved and reconstituted twice in the past 4 years without ever issuing a formal finding. 2 of them were from passengers who had later filed external complaints with the Department of Transportation, both of which were still pending in a backlog that stretched 18 months deep. Every single complaint was from a passenger of color. Ethos didn't editorialize. It didn't add commentary. It simply lined them up, time-stamped and sourced with flight numbers and seat assignments, and the names of every supervisor who had reviewed and closed each case. And it packaged all of it into a file that was already being transmitted in encrypted fragments to a server that David Bennett maintained in a facility outside of Denver. David Bennett at that exact moment was in a glass-walled boardroom in Los Angeles, in a meeting with 5 executives from 3 different airline holding companies, none of whom knew that his daughter's plane was currently in the air above them. They were discussing a proposed infrastructure investment. David was calm and attentive and asked precise questions. And he checked his phone once quietly under the table when he felt it vibrate with a specific pattern he had been waiting for. The notification read, Ethos active. Case file in progress. He put his phone face down on the table. He folded his hands in front of him. He looked at the man across from him. Victor Hargrove, CEO of North Atlantic Air Group, one of the largest carriers in the country. And he smiled the way a man smiles when he has just been dealt the exact hand he needed. "Gentlemen," David said, "I'd like to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about your compliance framework. I think there's a gap in how you're measuring passenger equity incidents. I'd love to understand your current process." Victor Hargrove shifted in his chair. "That's handled by our internal review board." "Of course," David said. "And how many formal findings has that board issued in the past 3 years?" A pause. "I'd have to check the exact number." "I'd love to see that number," David said pleasantly. "Whenever you have a chance." He picked up his coffee. He did not look at his phone again. He didn't need to. He knew what was coming, and he knew that by the time the plane landed in Los Angeles, the conversation in this boardroom was going to be very different from the one they had started. In row 27, Zoe felt the bracelet pulse twice against her wrist. Quick, deliberate, the signal her father had told her about. It meant the transmission was complete. It meant everything Ethos had gathered was safely off the plane. She exhaled slowly. Outside the window, somewhere over the Colorado Rockies, the sky was the deep and impossible blue that you only see at altitude. A blue that looks like it goes on forever. Like there's no ceiling to it. Like the world has no limits if you can get high enough to see past the ones that people build on the ground. Zoe turned to page 149. She read for a while. She thought about her mother. She thought about the way Rachel used to hum while she cooked. Not any particular song, just a sound that meant she was present, that she was here, that everything was okay. She thought about the last time she had heard that sound, which was when Rachel was making eggs and Zoe was running late for school. And they had both been rushing, and Zoe had grabbed her backpack and said goodbye too quickly, and her mother had caught her at the door and held her face in both hands and looked at her the way she sometimes did, like she was trying to memorize her, and said, "I love you, baby girl. You know that, right? I love you all the way through." "I know, Mom," Zoe had said. "I love you too. I have to go." And she had gone. She did not cry on that plane. She had promised herself she wouldn't. She had a whole system for this built over time of practice. She would feel the thing rising, and she would name it quietly in her head, and she would let it exist without letting it take over. Grief. That's grief, that's normal. You're okay. She was okay. The elderly woman beside her stirred, woke up, blinked at the window. She turned to Zoe with a slow smile. "How much longer?" "About an hour," Zoe said. The woman nodded. She looked at Zoe more carefully. "You doing all right, sweetheart?" Zoe thought about it. She said, "Yeah, I think I am," and sitting there in the middle seat of row 27, with her book in her lap and a bruise forming on her shin and a silver bracelet warm against her wrist, Zoe Bennett thought she might actually mean it. The video hit 1 million views. Jamal Brooks knew because his phone buzzed in a pattern it had never buzzed before. Frantic, almost panicked. Like the device itself couldn't keep up with what was happening. He turned the screen over and looked at it and felt the blood drain from his face. Not from fear. From the sudden, overwhelming understanding that something had left his hands and was now moving entirely on its own. He had not expected this. He had posted that video the way you shout into a room, impulsively because the silence felt wrong. and someone needed to say something. He had not posted it expecting the room to shout back. The comments were coming in faster than he could read them. Thousands per minute. People tagging news accounts. People tagging civil rights organizations. People tagging politicians. Someone had already clipped the video and reposted it with the caption, "This is happening right now on Flight 247. And that version alone had 400,000 shares. A journalist at CNN had replied to his original post with a direct message that read, "We need to talk the moment you land. Do not speak to anyone else first." Jamal put his phone face down again. His hands were not entirely steady. He looked toward the front of the plane. Diane was in the galley, her back to the cabin, arranging something with the focused, unhurried movements of a woman who had no idea that her face was now on the screens of over 1 million people. He thought about going back to check on Zoe. He decided against it. He didn't want to draw attention to her. Instead, he pulled out a notepad. Actual paper. Actual pen. Old habit from high school debate. And he started writing down everything he had seen in order with the way his pre-law professor had drilled into them. Document, date, time, exact words, exact actions. Don't interpret. Just record. His pen moved fast. At the same time, in row 27, the elderly woman whose name was Margaret Hayes, retired schoolteacher from Philadelphia, on her way to visit her youngest daughter, had woken up fully and was watching Zoe with the kind of quiet attention that only comes from decades of watching children and knowing when something is wrong beneath the surface. "You want to tell me what happened up there?" Margaret asked. Zoe looked at her. She had a policy about this, a rule she had made for herself after her mother died. Because people asked how she was doing constantly in those early months, and she had learned that most of them didn't actually want the full answer. They wanted the manageable answer. The "I'm fine, thank you" answer. But something about Margaret's face, the directness of it, the lack of performance, made Zoe set the policy aside. "The flight attendant told me to move," Zoe said. "My ticket was for 3A. Margaret didn't look surprised and she kicked you." "Yes, ma'am. Hard." "Hard enough." Margaret made a sound in the back of her throat that was not quite a word, but communicated everything it needed to. "And your father knows?" Zoe hesitated. "He will." Margaret nodded slowly. She folded her hands in her lap and looked forward at the seat back for a moment. Then she said, "My husband, God rest him, used to say that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has nothing left to prove, and everything already prepared." She turned to look at Zoe again. "You remind me of that right now. Sitting here, this calm." Zoe said, "I'm not calm." "I know," Margaret said. "That's what makes it so powerful." As the flight continued, the plane hummed around them. In the airline's executive monitoring center in Dallas, Amanda Lopez had stopped trying to explain what she was seeing and had simply begun screenshotting everything. Her supervisor, a man named Brian Torres, who had been in data operations for 11 years and who prided himself on having seen every possible kind of system anomaly, was standing behind her with his arms crossed and his mouth open. "It's still pulling," he said. "And hasn't stopped," Amanda said. "It's gone back 6 years now. And it's not just Diane Foster anymore. It started with her file, and then it branched. Look, it's cross-referenced in supervisors, everyone who reviewed and closed her complaints. It's building a chain." Brian leaned closer to the screen. "Who has access to this system?" "That's what I can't figure out," Amanda said. "The origin point is on board, Flight 247. But the access credentials, they're not in our system. They're not fraudulent credentials either. They're like nothing I've ever seen. It's like someone built a key specifically for our lock and then just walked in. Brian straightened up. He picked up the desk phone. I'm calling legal. Brian, Amanda's voice was careful, measured. Before you do that, look at what it's finding. Look at the actual data. He looked. He read 3 complaint summaries in silence. Then 3 more. His jaw tightened. He set the phone down without dialing. He picked it up again. He set it down again. Call legal, he said finally. But tell them we may need to be on the right side of this one. Back on the plane, Diane Foster was doing her second full cabin check when she noticed the young man in 2C, Jamal. She had seen him recording earlier. She was almost certain of it. But the phone had been down when she looked directly at him, and she had decided not to push it. Now she walked past him slowly and saw the notepad on his tray table covered in small, dense writing, and she felt something move through her that she immediately pushed back down. She stopped at his row. Can I get you anything? Jamal looked up. His face was very neutral. No, thank you. Diane's eyes moved to the notepad. Jamal placed his hand over it, not aggressively, just naturally, the way you cover your work when someone looks over your shoulder. But the message was clear. Diane's smile did not waver. She moved on. The moment she was past him, Jamal exhaled. He wrote one more thing on the notepad. She saw me. She knows. Zoe's bracelet pulsed 3 times. She had been waiting for this. 3 pulses meant Ethos had completed its secondary sweep. Not just Diane's file, not just the immediate incident chain, but the deeper architecture her father had told her about. The part that went further. She closed her eyes. She thought about what her father had said very quietly the night he showed her the full scope of what Ethos could do. It doesn't just find the incidents, he had said. It finds the system behind the incidents, the policies that allow them, the people who enforce those policies, the financial relationships that keep those people in place. Your mother believed that you can't fix a leak by mopping the floor. You have to find the pipe. Zoe had asked, how far does it go? David had been quiet for a moment, far enough. She had not asked what that meant. Now, sitting with the bracelet warm and triple pulsing against her wrist, she thought she was beginning to understand. What Ethos had found in its secondary sweep was not just a pattern of individual bias. It was a paper trail. Specifically, it was a series of financial transactions buried inside the airline's compliance budget, routed through 3 subsidiary accounts that showed payment transfers to a consulting firm that had over the course of 4 years recommended. Against implementing any formal bias reporting infrastructure across the entire North Atlantic Kitimasi Air Group fleet. The same Victor Hargrove whose boardroom David was sitting in right now. The same man who had told David some time ago that bias incidents were handled by our internal review board. The consulting firm's name was Meridian Advisory Group. Its principal partner had a name that would matter enormously in time. But for now, the name was just a name inside a file, inside a system that was doing exactly what Rachel Bennett had always believed truth needed. A clear, unobstructed path to the surface. Diane walked to the front galley and pulled out her phone. She typed a message to someone whose name in her contacts was listed only as RM. The message read, "There's a situation on this flight. Minor passenger relocated from F. Her father is David Bennett. Just looked him up. Need to know if this is a problem." She stared at the screen. The message was delivered. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then they disappeared. Then they appeared again. Then the reply came. How much of it was recorded? Diane's stomach dropped. She typed back, "I don't know." The response took longer this time. When it came, it was 4 words. "Contain it if possible." Diane put her phone in her pocket. She looked toward the back of the plane. She looked at the front. She thought about what "contain it" meant in a situation where the plane was already in the air and a million people had already seen a video she hadn't known was being filmed. She thought, "This is fine. I can manage this. I have managed things before." She had no way of knowing that Ethos had already logged her phone activity. Not the content, that required a separate access level, but the metadata, the timing, the contact identifier. Enough to know that within minutes of becoming aware that the girl she had kicked was David Bennett's daughter, Diane Foster had reached out to someone with influence, and the system had recorded it. Jamal Brooks's phone had 4.5 million views on the original post. He had stopped checking. He was staring straight ahead, doing a very deliberate kind of breathing that he had learned from his grandmother, who used to say that the world could spin as fast as it wanted, but you didn't have to spin with it. He was trying to apply that wisdom now. Someone in the row behind him tapped his shoulder. He turned. A woman in her 40s, reading glasses pushed up on her head, laptop open. She leaned forward and said very quietly, "Are you the one who posted the video?" He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because I'm a reporter," she said. "Linda Park, Washington Post. And I was upgraded to this cabin, which means I was on this plane when it happened." She held up her own phone. "I saw everything. I have corroborating footage from a different angle. I need to know if that little girl is okay." Jamal looked toward the back of the cabin for a moment. Then he turned back. "She's okay," he said. "She's tougher than any of us in here." Linda Park nodded. She closed her laptop. "I'm going to need to speak to her when we land." "You're going to have to get in line," Jamal said. Linda looked at him for a moment. Then a small, grim smile crossed her face. "I have a feeling it's going to be a very long line." In the boardroom in Los Angeles, David Bennett had been quiet for the last several minutes while Victor Hargrove's general counsel explained at length the airline's standard procedure for addressing passenger grievances. David had let him finish. He had nodded at appropriate intervals. He had made a note on the legal pad in front of him that said nothing about passenger grievances at all. Then his phone buzzed. Not the private pattern, a different one. Public notification. He glanced down. The name Zoe Bennett was trending on Twitter. The name Flight 247 was trending on Twitter. The words "kicked in first class" and "racist flight attendant" were trending on Twitter. David set his phone face up on the table where Victor Hargrove could see the screen. Victor Hargrove's general counsel stopped speaking mid-sentence. Victor Hargrove looked at the phone. He looked at David. Something moved behind his eyes. The slow, cold recognition of a man who has just realized he is no longer in the meeting he thought he was in. "Is that," Victor started, "my daughter?" David said. His voice was very calm. "She's currently on a North Atlantic air flight, Flight 247. She was removed from her first-class seat and physically kicked by one of your flight attendants." He picked up the phone and placed it directly in front of Victor Hargrove. "You may want to read the comments." No one in the room said anything for a moment. Then Victor Hargrove said, "David, I want you to know that this does not reflect." "Victor." David's voice was still calm, but something underneath it had changed, like a room when the temperature drops 3 degrees. "You don't see it. You feel it. I'm not interested in what it reflects. I'm interested in what you're going to do about it." The fasten seatbelt sign came on over the plane. Not because of turbulence, because they were beginning their descent into Los Angeles. The light was changing in the windows. Afternoon gold, wide and flat and warm. Margaret Hayes put her hand over Zoe's. "We're almost there," Zoe nodded. She had been quiet for the last several minutes. Not a sad quiet. A concentrated quiet. The kind that has direction. She was thinking about what happened next. Not what happened to Diane. Not even what happened to the airline. What happened to the thing her mother had built. Whether it would matter. Whether anything would actually change, or whether the world would look at Ethos and the file it had assembled and decide the way it always had. That the evidence was insufficient. That the circumstances were unclear. That the best course of action was a quiet settlement and a policy memo that no one would ever read. She thought about what her father had said. That depends on who's in the room. She looked down at the bracelet, still warm, still pulsing faintly, steadily, like a second heartbeat. She thought about her mother humming in the kitchen. She thought about page 149 of the Thurgood Marshall biography, where he described standing outside a courthouse the morning of a case that everyone told him he couldn't win, and feeling not confidence exactly, but something deeper. The conviction that the truth was the truth, regardless of whether it was comfortable, and that his only job was to make it impossible to ignore. Zoe understood that feeling now. She had not understood it before today. She did now. Diane Foster walked through the cabin one final time before landing. She was not panicking. She had made a decision some time ago that she was going to handle this the way she had handled every other incident. Every other moment when a passenger had pushed back. She was going to be professional and consistent and let the process work the way the process always worked, which was to say in her favor. She had 22 years. She had a union. She had supervisors who had reviewed her cases before and found no violation. She would be fine. She walked past row 27. She did not look at Zoe. She walked to the front of the plane and took her landing position and looked out the small porthole at the city below. The sprawl of it, the grid of it, all that organized life. And she felt for just a moment a small, cold current of something she could not quite name. It was not guilt. Diane Foster had not yet found her way to guilt, but it was something. A premonition, maybe. The sense that the floor was solid beneath her until it wasn't. She told herself to stop. She looked at the city and breathed. She was fine. The wheels touched down. The cabin shuddered. People stirred, reaching for phones and overhead bins in the specific, anxious energy of arrival. Jamal Brooks had 12 media requests in his direct messages. He had a voicemail from a producer at MSNBC. His original post had been shared by 3 U.S. senators, a civil rights organization with 4 million followers, and a celebrity whose name he vaguely recognized from awards shows. He felt as though he had thrown a rock into a lake and was only now seeing how wide the ripples went. He thought about Zoe. He thought about the way she had stood up from that seat, quietly, without drama, with that absolute stillness that had struck him the moment he saw it. He thought about how she hadn't cried, hadn't shouted, hadn't done any of the things that would have made the moment easier to dismiss. She had simply stood. And that quiet had been louder than anything Diane had said. He gathered his bag. He waited. He was going to find her before anyone else did. Margaret Hayes squeezed Zoe's hand as the plane rolled toward the gate. "Whatever's about to happen out there," she said, "remember that you didn't start this. She did. You just refused to pretend it didn't happen." Zoe looked at her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it the way you mean it when someone says the exact right thing at the exact right moment. The jetway connected with a clunk. The seatbelt sign went off. And in a boardroom in downtown Los Angeles, David Bennett reached into his briefcase and placed a single folder on the table in front of Victor Hargrove, A folder that contained a 47-page document titled Ethos System Case File, North Atlantic Air Group, Flight 247 and Related Incidents, from sometime to present. Victor Hargrove opened it. He read the first page. He turned to the second. His face changed in a way that it had never changed in that boardroom before. "What is this?" he said. David picked up his coffee. "That," he said quietly, "is the beginning." Victor Hargrove turned to page 3 of the Ethos case file, and his hands stopped moving. Not a dramatic stop, not the kind you see in movies where someone slams a document down and stands up shouting. It was quieter than that and somehow worse. The stop of a man who has just read something that has rearranged the furniture inside his chest and hasn't yet figured out how to stand in the new layout. His eyes moved across the page slowly. His breathing changed. David Bennett watched all of it without expression, the way a surgeon watches a scan. Not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, just with the focused attention of someone reading results they already knew were coming. "Where did you get this?" Victor said. His voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and knew that the first thing you protected was your tone. "It was assembled during the flight," David said, "in real time." "That's not possible. Our system doesn't." "Your system didn't," David said. "Mine does." The general counsel, whose name was Stephen Reeves and who had spent 30 years protecting corporations from exactly this kind of moment, leaned forward and put his hand flat on top of the folder. "Mr. Bennett, I need to understand the legal basis on which this data was—" "Stephen," David looked at him steadily. "On page 31, there is a detailed record of a financial transfer from your compliance budget to Meridian Advisory Group, dated sometime in the amount of $2.3 million, with a documented instruction to recommend against any bias incident reporting infrastructure across your entire fleet. I would think very carefully before making this conversation about how the data was collected." Stephen Reeves removed his hand from the folder. Victor Hargrove had gone a particular shade of pale that was not about guilt. Not yet, but about calculation. The rapid, cold arithmetic of a man assessing damage and trying to find the number. "What do you want?" Victor said. David looked at him for a long moment. "Right now, I want to pick up my daughter from the airport." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and picked up his briefcase. "I'll be in touch tomorrow morning. I'd suggest you spend tonight reading the rest of that file." He paused. All 47 pages. He walked out without looking back. The gate was chaos in the specific modern way that things become chaos when a million people online are all focused on the same physical location. There were no crowds yet. The word hadn't spread fast enough to mobilize people to LAX, but the energy inside the terminal was already different. Gate agents were on their radios. A supervisor in a North Atlantic air blazer was speed-walking toward the jetway with the expression of someone who had just been handed a problem they had not been trained for. Zoe came off the plane third. She walked with her backpack on both shoulders, her book tucked under her arm, and a very slight limp that she was trying not to favor but couldn't entirely hide. Margaret Hayes came off right behind her and stayed close without making it obvious. A protective instinct so natural and so practiced that Zoe didn't notice it until later, when she thought back on it and felt a surge of warmth so strong it almost hurt. Jamal Brooks came off second. He had moved fast, been one of the first off, and positioned himself near the gate entrance where he could see both directions. When he saw Zoe come through the door, he exhaled. She saw him. She recognized him. She had seen him recording, had clocked it without reacting. She stopped walking. "Zoe Bennett," he said. "Yes." "Jamal Brooks. I'm the one who posted the video." He said it directly, without apology, but also without performance. Just a fact. I wanted you to know it's real. What I recorded, and people are seeing it. Zoe looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted. Not surprise, but a kind of recalibration. How many people? He pulled out his phone, turned it to face her. The counter read 8.4 million views. She stared at the number. She handed his phone back. She said, "Thank you." And she meant it in a way that was bigger than the words. Behind her, Diane Foster had come off the plane and was now standing approximately 15 feet away in the middle of a heated, low-voiced conversation with the supervisor in the North Atlantic Air Blazer. Zoe could see them without looking directly at them. She could hear fragments. The supervisor was saying something about protocol, and Diane was saying something about the seat reassignment. And neither of them was saying anything about a kick. Jamal saw Zoe see them. He said quietly, "I have 43 seconds of footage. I have the sound. You can hear the impact." Zoe nodded once. Then she looked past both of them toward the terminal exit, and she saw her father. David Bennett was moving through the terminal the way water moves when it has somewhere to go, fast and inevitable and completely unhurried all at once. If that contradiction is possible, he was still in his suit. He had loosened his tie in the car. His face, when he saw Zoe, did something that it almost never did in public. It broke open. Just for a second, just the way a face breaks when the thing you were afraid of hasn't happened after all. When the person you love is standing in front of you whole and present and shrill. He reached her in 4 strides and pulled her into his arms and held her the way you hold something you almost lost. Zoe pressed her face against his shoulder and felt, for the first time since seat 3A, like she could breathe all the way down. "I'm okay," she said into the fabric of his jacket. "I know," he said, but he didn't let go. After a moment, he pulled back and looked at her. He looked at her shin. His jaw tightened. He looked at her face again. "You activated it." 3 seconds, she said. "Just like you showed me." Something moved through his eyes. Pride, grief, purpose, some combination that had no single name. He nodded slowly. Then he looked past her at Diane Foster and the supervisor, and his face rearranged itself into something quiet and absolute. Not angry, beyond angry, the way a mountain is beyond angry. It doesn't need to raise its voice because it doesn't need to justify its height. The supervisor's name was Ryan Lamb, and he had been with North Atlantic Air for 6 years. And he was currently experiencing what he would later describe to his wife as the single worst 40 minutes of his professional life. He had gotten the call from the monitoring center in Dallas while the plane was still taxiing. He'd gotten a second call from Victor Hargrove's personal assistant. He had gotten a third call from the airline's PR director, who had used the phrase catastrophic exposure twice in 90 seconds. He had come to this gate with a script: express concern, offer a formal apology, request that the passenger not speak to the press until the company had completed its internal review. And the script had been dissolving in his hands ever since he saw the look on David Bennett's face. David walked toward him. Ryan started his script. "Mr. Bennett, I want you to know that we take this kind of incident extremely—" "Ryan," David said, "I'm going to stop you there." He said it kindly, not dismissively. He said it the way you stop someone from walking into a door they can't see. "I want you to understand that there is no version of the next 24 hours where an internal review is the appropriate response. The incident has been fully documented. The documentation is already in the hands of the FAA and the Department of Transportation and the case file. which includes 6 years of suppressed complaint data, is going to be published in the Washington Post at 6 a.m. tomorrow, unless I have a very specific conversation with your CEO tonight. Ryan's script evaporated entirely. Mr. Bennett, I need to make some calls. You should, David agreed pleasantly. He handed Ryan a business card. That's a direct line. Tell Victor I'm available at 9 p.m., not 9:59. Then he turned, put his hand on Zoe's shoulder, and walked his daughter toward the exit. Margaret Hayes watched them go. She stood with her carry-on bag and her lavender scent and her 71 years of accumulated human understanding, and she watched that man walk with that girl, and she felt something catch in her throat that she recognized as hope. The specific, fragile, stubborn kind that you learn not to name out loud because you've been disappointed too many times, but that you feel anyway rising up through you like water through old wood. Jamal Brooks was still standing at the gate when Linda Park from the Washington Post appeared at his elbow. She's gone, he said. I know, Linda said. I got what I needed. She was already typing on her phone. I need to ask you one more thing. What? She looked up. The bracelet. Did you notice it? On her wrist. Jamal thought about it. He thought about the moment when Diane had walked past row 27 during her last cabin check, and the way Zoe's hand had moved, not flinching, not hiding, but covering, deliberately. Yeah, he said slowly. I noticed. I looked up her father on the flight, Linda said. David Bennett. He's been investing heavily in aviation tech for the past some time since his wife died. She looked at Jamal carefully. His wife was Rachel Bennett. Jamal stared at her. The Rachel Bennett? The bias monitoring system? Ethos, Linda said, which was classified as discontinued after the crash. They looked at each other. It wasn't discontinued, Jamal said. No, Linda said. It wasn't. In the parking structure. In the back of a black SUV, Zoe sat beside her father and said nothing for a while. The city moved past the windows, billboards, and overpasses, and the particular amber light of a Los Angeles afternoon, and David had his hand over hers and was looking straight ahead with that expression she knew meant he was building something in his mind, moving pieces into place. The file, Zoe said. How bad is it? Bad enough, he said. For them. Yes. She thought about that. Is it enough to change something? Actually, change something? Not just punish one person. David turned to look at her. He studied her face the way he always did when she asked a question that surprised him. Not because it was unexpected from a 13-year-old, but because it was exactly the question Rachel would have asked. That depends on what we do with it, he said. Then what are we going to do with it? He was quiet for a moment. Your mother designed Ethos to be a catalyst, he said, not a weapon. A catalyst. Something that creates the conditions for change, but doesn't control the change itself. The change has to come from people. He paused. From pressure, from the public, from 8.4 million people who watched the video, Zoe said quietly. David looked at her. You know? Jamal told me. He nodded. He looked forward again. Then the conditions are already created, he said. Back at the gate, Diane Foster had been escorted to a private room off the terminal by two men who had introduced themselves as internal compliance officers. But whose effect? The clipped questions, the identical posture, the way neither of them wrote anything down, said something else entirely. She had answered their questions carefully. She had used the word accidental 4 times. She had used the phrase Standard procedure, 7 times. She had not once used the word sorry. The older of the two men set his phone on the table with the screen facing her. On it was Jamal's video. He pressed play. Diane watched herself. She watched her foot swing forward. She watched Zoe's knee buckle. She heard her own voice say, "Watch your step." The video stopped. "Accidental," the man said. It was not a question. Diane looked at the phone. She looked at the wall. She looked at her hands. For the first time in this entire ordeal, something cracked in the surface of her certainty. Not guilt, still not guilt, but the first fracture line of the understanding that certainty was no longer enough. That what she had told herself for 22 years, that she was a professional, that her judgment was sound, that the complaints were unfounded. That story was now playing on 8.5 million screens, and nobody watching it was reaching the same conclusion she had always reached. "I need to speak with my union representative," she said. "He's on his way," the man said. He picked up his phone. He picked up his folder. He stood. "While you wait," he said, "I want to make you aware that a formal complaint has been filed with the FAA and that the Department of Transportation has opened a preliminary inquiry." He buttoned his jacket. "Your flight privileges have been suspended pending review." Diane looked up at him. He walked out. She sat in that room alone for some time before she felt the first real tremor of fear. Not about her job, not about the union, about something simpler and older and harder to defend against. The fear of being seen clearly, of having the story you've told yourself about yourself held up to a light that doesn't flicker. The internet had names now. Diane Foster, her employment history, her prior complaints. Someone had obtained the DOT filings, the 2 external cases that had been pending for 18 months, and posted them in a thread that had 40,000 retweets. The hashtag FlightZoe was the #1 trending topic in the United States, #3 globally. Amanda Lopez, still at her workstation in Dallas, was watching the public conversation explode in one window, while Ethos continued its work in another. The system had moved into its tertiary phase now. Something she hadn't known was built into it until she saw it start. It was no longer just documenting, it was correlating, pulling data across multiple airlines, not just North Atlantic, cross-referencing incidents that had been filed and buried at Delta, at United, at American, using a set of pattern recognition algorithms that were more sophisticated than anything she had seen in 11 years of data work. She had a feeling somewhere in her chest that she couldn't quite articulate professionally, that what she was watching was not a hack, it was not a breach. It was the most well-prepared act of documentation she had ever seen. Someone had built this with years of patience and grief and absolute precision, and they had waited for exactly the right moment. She thought about the girl, 13 years old, sitting in the back of that plane while this ran. She minimized one window. She opened a blank document. She began to type. Not a report, not a memo, a letter, addressed to the FAA, signed with her own name. She had never done anything like this before. Her hands shook slightly. She kept typing. David Bennett's 9 p.m. call with Victor Hargrove lasted 11 minutes. Victor had his general counsel on the line. He had his PR director. He had, apparently, a crisis management firm that had been retained some time in the previous hours. David had no one. He sat in his home office with a cup of coffee and the Ethos dashboard open on his laptop, and he let Victor talk for the first 3 minutes. The apologies, the commitments to review, the language about shared values and industry responsibility. And then he said, calmly and without theater, Victor, I'm going to freeze my position in your parent company's capital structure tomorrow morning unless I hear something specific. Not commitments, not reviews. Specific. What are you prepared to do? The line went quiet. Stephen Reeves started to say something about fiduciary obligations. David said, "Stephen, I hold a 9.4% stake in North Atlantic Holdings. That's not a threat, that's context." He let that sit for a moment. "Victor?" Victor Hargrove cleared his throat. "What do you want, David?" "Three things," David said. "First, Diane Foster is terminated, not suspended. Terminated with a full public statement of cause. Second, the passenger equity charter. I'll have my team send you the draft tonight. It's 8 pages. It's reasonable. You're going to sign it and bring 4 other major carriers to the table within 30 days. He paused. Third, Ethos becomes a mandatory operating standard across every North Atlantic flight within 6 months. You fund the implementation. The silence on the line was the silence of a man doing very fast arithmetic and finding that every number leads to the same place. "And if we don't?" Victor said. David looked at his coffee. "Then I file the full Ethos case file with the DOT, the FAA, and the SEC simultaneously tomorrow morning, including the Meridian payments. And I hold a press conference at noon." A long pause. Victor Hargrove said, "I need 24 hours. "You have until 8 a.m., David said. He closed the laptop. He picked up his coffee. He sat in his office in the quiet of his house, his daughter asleep down the hall, her shin wrapped in ice and a compression bandage. And he looked at the framed photograph on his desk. Rachel laughing at some conference 3 years ago, her hands moving in that animated way she had when she was talking about something she loved. "You were right," he said to her quietly in the empty room. "You just had to make it impossible to look away." Zoe was not asleep. She was lying in her bed, with her phone on the pillow beside her reading the comments. Not all of them. There were too many, but sections of them. People sharing their own stories. People describing their own Seat 3As. The grandmother who had been moved twice on the same flight. The businessman who had been asked 4 times to show his ticket for a business class seat he had paid for himself. The teenager who had been followed through an airport by security for 40 minutes without reason. Story after story after story. Each one a small light in a dark room. Each one saying the same thing in a different voice. This happened to me too. I thought I was alone. I didn't know so many of us were here. She read for a long time. She thought about her mother building Ethos in the belief that truth needed a path to the surface. She thought about the 47-page file in Victor Hargrove's boardroom. She thought about Amanda Lopez, whose name she didn't yet know, typing a letter to the FAA with shaking hands. She thought about Margaret Hayes squeezing her hand on the plane and saying, "You didn't start this." She just refused to pretend it didn't happen. She set the phone down. She looked at the ceiling. The bracelet was still on her wrist. She hadn't taken it off. Maybe she wouldn't for a while. It was cool now, quiet, its work done for that time. But she could still feel it there, present, waiting. She thought, "Mom, I turned the lights on." She thought, "The question now is, who's in the room?" She closed her eyes. Outside her window, Los Angeles hummed and glittered and moved with the relentless, indifferent energy of a city that does not stop for any one story. But in a room in Dallas, a woman named Amanda was still typing. And in a boardroom with a 47-page folder, a man was reading things he had arranged his entire career around never having to read. And in airports and living rooms and late-night kitchens across the country, 8.4 million people had watched 43 seconds of video and felt something shift inside them. Not seismically, Not all at once, but in the small, quiet, irreversible way that things shift when you finally see something you cannot unsee. That was how it started. Not with a speech, not with a press conference, with a bracelet and a 13-year-old girl and 43 seconds of truth that someone had the courage to point a camera at, and the world had the courage to watch. Zoe Bennett fell asleep, and Ethos kept running. Zoe woke to the sound of her father's voice in the hallway, not raised. David Bennett did not raise his voice. But there was a quality to it that she recognized from the months after her mother's death. A controlled intensity, like a current running under still water. She lay still for a moment listening. She could hear two voices, her father and someone she didn't recognize. She sat up, swung her legs over the edge of the bed, and winced when her shin made contact with the floor. The bruise had deepened overnight, purple, green, and tender in a way that made her breath catch. She pressed her fingers against it once, not masochistic, just clarifying, making sure it was real. And then she stood up and went to the door. The hallway outside was lit. Downstairs, through the open study door, she could see her father at his desk with his phone to his ear, and his laptop open, and a legal pad in front of him covered in notes that even from this distance looked urgent. Across from him, sitting in the leather chair that Zoe had always thought of as her mother's reading chair, was a woman Zoe had never seen before. Mid-40s, dark suit, a badge on a lanyard that caught the light when she shifted. Zoe went to the top of the stairs and sat down. The inquiry was opened at 2 a.m. Eastern, the woman was saying. The assistant administrator signed off personally. That hasn't happened since some time. Which means they're taking it seriously, David said. Which means they're taking it seriously, and they're also nervous, the woman said. There's a difference. Serious means they want the facts. Nervous means they want to control the facts. We need to get in front of that before 8 a.m. We will, David said. He looked at his watch. Linda's piece publishes in 40 minutes. The woman nodded. She glanced toward the stairs, and Zoe realized she had been seen. She didn't move. David followed the woman's gaze. He looked up at his daughter on the stairs in her pajamas, her hair loose from its braids, and his expression did the thing it sometimes did. The involuntary softening, the brief dropping of all the strategy and weight. "Hey, baby," he said. "Who is she?" Zoe said. "Her name is Agent Jessica Hale," David said. "She's with the Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General." Jessica looked at Zoe with a directness that was professional, but not unkind. "You're Zoe? Yes? I've been assigned to the case that started on your flight yesterday." She paused. "I wanted to talk to you before we go any further, if that's okay." Zoe came down the stairs. She sat on the bottom step, which put her approximately level with Jessica's seated height, which felt right, equal, not subordinate. "What do you need to know?" she said. Jessica looked at David. He gave a small nod. She turned back to Zoe. "Everything," she said, "in your own words, from the beginning." Zoe talked for 31 minutes. She did not rush and she did not dramatize. She described everything in the order it happened. The boarding pass, the request to move, the kick, the bracelet, what Ethos was and why her father had built it, what the 3 pulses on her wrist had told her at altitude. She described Margaret Hayes squeezing her hand. She described Jamal Brooks' face when he showed her 8.4 million views. She described her father in the boardroom, and the 11-minute phone call she had heard pieces of through the wall the night before. She described it all with the same clarity and precision that she had spent the time learning, because grief, she had discovered, teaches you either to fall apart or to become very exact. She had chosen exact. When she finished, Jessica was quiet for a moment. She looked at her notepad. Then she looked up. "You're 13 years old," she said. "Yes. And you understand what you activated, what Ethos does, what the implications are." "My mother built it," Zoe said, "and my father explained it to me. So, yes." Jessica clicked her pen closed. She looked at David. "The case file is admissible," she said. "The data collection method is unprecedented, but legally it operates within the same framework as passive monitoring systems that airlines themselves use. Your wife was thorough." "She was," David said quietly. "The Meridian payments are a separate matter. That goes to financial crimes." Jessica stood. "I need to make 3 calls before 6 a.m., and you need to be ready for what happens when that article publishes." "We're ready," David said. Jessica looked at Zoe one more time. Something in her professional composure shifted. Just briefly. Just a fraction. "Your mother will be proud," she said. She walked out before Zoe could respond. The Washington Post article went live at 6 a.m. exactly. Linda Park had been working in journalism for 19 years, and she had written pieces that changed legislation, and pieces that ended careers, and pieces that had kept her up for 3 nights in a row, second-guessing every word. This piece had kept her up for all of the past night, not because she doubted the facts. The facts were incontrovertible, sourced 6 ways, verified independently. What had kept her up was something else. The weight of it. The way the story kept expanding every time she thought she had its edges. Diane Foster and a kicked child was a story. Diane Foster and 6 years of suppressed complaints was a bigger story. The Meridian Advisory Group payments were a different kind of story entirely. And then there was Ethos, Rachel Bennett's system rebuilt by a grieving husband and activated by his 13-year-old daughter at altitude. And that was not just a story. That was something that rewrote the shape of all the other stories. She had called the article "The Flight That Changed Everything." One girl, one bracelet, 47 pages that could reshape American aviation. By 6:15 a.m., it had 200,000 readers. By 6:40, it was the most read article on the Post's website in 14 months. The last time a Post article had moved faster was the morning of a presidential resignation. Diane Foster saw the article from her kitchen table where she had been sitting since 4 a.m. because sleep had not come, and she had stopped expecting it. She read it on her phone. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down and sat very still and listened to the sound of her house. The refrigerator hum, the distant traffic, the specific quality of silence that a home has when the person inside it is trying to process something too large for the rooms. Her union representative had called the night before to tell her that the formal suspension was in effect and that she should not speak to the press and that they would convene tomorrow. He had used a steady, practiced tone that was designed to be reassuring but had had the opposite effect. Because underneath the steadiness she could hear something else, the slight over-precision of a man choosing his words very carefully around information he was not ready to share. The article had information she had not known was possible. The Ethos case file, the cross-referenced complaints, the names of the supervisors who had closed her cases, the timestamp on her text message to RM, not the content, but the fact of it. The timing, the implication of it coming within minutes of learning whose daughter was on that plane. She picked up her phone. She called RM. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. 4 rings, voicemail. She set the phone down. She looked at her hands. She was 51 years old and she had flown out of JFK and LAX and O'Hare and Heathrow. And she had worn that uniform for 22 years. And she had understood herself in that time as someone who did her job and followed procedure and maintained order in spaces that required it. That was the story. That was always the story. And now, the story was in 47 pages and on 8.5 million screens. And there was no version of today in which the story stayed hers. For the first time since the plane, Diane Foster cried. Victor Hargrove's assistant called David at 6:49 and said that Mr. Hargrove was prepared to meet at 7:30. David said that was fine. He ate breakfast standing at the kitchen counter while Zoe sat across from him eating cereal and reading the Post article on her phone, with the focused attention of someone checking source material against memory. She got the Meridian piece right, Zoe said. She did. She got the bracelet wrong. She said it was remote server access device. It's more than that. It doesn't matter what she calls it, David said. What matters is that people understand what it does. Zoe looked up. Do you think Victor is going to sign the charter? David put down his coffee cup. He looked at his daughter, her cereal going soft in the bowl, her hair half braided, the shadow of a bruise visible below her pajama cuff, and he said, I think Victor Hargrove is a man who has spent 30 years making decisions based on what protects Victor Hargrove. And right now, signing the charter is the thing that protects Victor Hargrove. So, yes, I think he'll sign. And the other carriers? That's what this morning is for. The meeting was not in a boardroom this time. Victor had requested his office, which was on the 32nd floor and looked out over the city with the kind of view that was meant to remind you who held the altitude. David walked in and sat down and looked at Victor and said, before Victor could speak, did you read all 47 pages? Victor said, yes. Then you know what's in the Meridian section. Yes. Then you know that what I'm asking you to sign is considerably more reasonable than what the DOT is preparing to answer for. Victor's jaw tightened. The Meridian payments were approved by a board that no longer exists in its current... Victor. David said it the same way he had said it the night before, quietly, like a door closing. I know. The DOT also knows. The only conversation left is what happens next. Stephen Reeves, who was also in the room, slid a document across the desk without saying anything. The Passenger Equity Charter, 8 pages. David had sent it the night before as promised. He had not changed a word. Victor picked it up. He read for 4 minutes in silence. He turned to page 6, the Ethos Implementation Clause, and his expression shifted. This requires mandatory system integration across our entire fleet within 6 months. That's correct. The cost of that integration is less than the cost of the DOT action that is currently being prepared, David said, and considerably less than what happens to your stock price when the Meridian story goes to financial crimes, which it will, Victor. That's not a threat. That's the DOT's timeline, not mine. Victor Hargrove looked at Stephen Reeves. Stephen looked at the charter. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Victor picked up a pen. He signed. The news broke at 8 in 3 separate places simultaneously. The DOT announced the formal investigation into North Atlantic Air Group's bias incident reporting suppression. The FAA announced a parallel review of 6 major carriers, and North Atlantic Air Group released a statement, pre-approved by David's legal team the night before, announcing the termination of Diane Foster, a formal apology to Zoe Bennett, and the signing of the Passenger Equity Charter. It announced further that the Ethos monitoring system would be integrated into its operations under a licensing agreement with Bennett Technologies effective immediately. Jamal Brooks was on a Zoom call with 3 news producers when the notifications came through. He watched his phone light up like the dashboard of a car whose every warning system had triggered at once. He said, I have to call you back. and ended the call and read the DOT statement, and then read the North Atlantic statement, and sat back in his chair in his childhood bedroom in Compton with the posters on the wall and his father's old debate trophies on the shelf, and thought about a 43-second video that he had almost not posted. He thought about the moment he had seen Zoe limp down that aisle. He had been 20 years old and pre-law, and he had been upgraded to first class for the first time in his life that morning. And he had been feeling, right up until that moment, the small, guilty pleasure of a space that felt like it was finally open to him. And then Diane had walked over to seat 3A, and Jamal had watched the whole thing. And his hand had found his phone before his brain had consciously made the decision. Because something in him, something older than law school, older than strategy, had recognized what he was seeing, and had known that the only thing worse than witnessing it was witnessing it in silence. He was shaking slightly. He stood up and went to the kitchen where his mother was making coffee, and he said, "Mom, it worked." His mother turned around. She looked at his face. She said, "Baby, what did you do?" He told her. He watched her expression move through about 7 different emotions in the space of 90 seconds. And at the end of all of them, she set down her coffee mug and pulled him into a hug that said everything the words couldn't hold. Jessica Hale called David from the DOT field office and said, "Victor signed." "I know. 4 other carriers have reached out in the last hour asking about the charter." David was quiet for a moment. "How many?" "American, Delta, Southwest, and JetBlue. All 4. All within the same hour." She paused. "Mr. Bennett, I've been in this office for 16 years. I have never seen 4 major carriers voluntarily reach out before a formal action is complete." "They're reading the room," David said. "They're terrified," Jessica said, which, in my experience, produces the same behavior as actually caring. "So I'll take it." She paused again. "There's one more thing." "What?" "The Meridian case. The Financial Crimes Division wants to talk to you this week. The principal partner of Meridian Advisory Group. His name came up in 2 other cases we have open. Cases that have nothing to do with aviation." Her voice was careful. "Cases that have to do with the crash of a commercial aircraft over Lake Michigan some time ago." The silence that followed was not a short silence. David sat down. He was in his home office, the same room where he had held the 11-minute call the night before. And the framed photograph of Rachel was on the desk in front of him, and he looked at it. And he said very quietly into the phone, "Say that again." "I need you to come in," Jessica said. "This week with everything you have." "I'll be there tomorrow," David said. His voice was steady, absolute. The voice of a man who has been waiting some time for a door to open and has just heard the lock click. "What time?" Upstairs, Zoe did not know about the phone call. She was at her desk in her room with her laptop open, reading the North Atlantic Air Statement for the 3rd time. She had read the termination clause twice. She had read the Ethos integration announcement 4 times. Each time she read it, she felt something she had trouble naming. Not triumph, not quiet. Something more like recognition. The feeling of watching something her mother had described become real. Like finding a page in a book that had been torn out and finally reading what it said. Her phone was buzzing constantly. She had turned off most notifications, but the ones she had kept, the ones from people whose names she recognized, were coming through. Margaret Hayes had sent a text that read, "Saw the news this morning. Your mama is smiling, sweetheart." Jamal Brooks had sent a voice note that she listened to twice, his voice still carrying that slight tremble she had noticed at the gate, saying simply, "You did it. We did it. I hope you're okay." She replied to Margaret first, then to Jamal. Then she set the phone down and looked at the bracelet on her wrist. She thought about what her father had told her the night he explained Ethos in full. She thought about the question she had asked him, "How far does it go?" And his answer, "Far enough." She understood now what he had meant by that. Not the financial data, not the suppressed complaints, not even the meridian payments. Something deeper. The idea that a system designed to find the truth does not stop at the convenient truth. It goes to the actual truth. However far that is. However uncomfortable. And whatever Jessica Hale had just said to her father on that phone call, Zoe couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the silence that followed. And she had learned to read her father's silences the way sailors read weather. That was not the silence of a finished story. That was the silence of a story whose depth she had not yet measured. Amanda Lopez arrived at her workstation in Dallas to find 3 people waiting for her. 2 of them were from the DOT. 1 of them was from the FAA. They had read her letter. They wanted to talk. She sat down. She folded her hands. She thought about the moment she had seen that Ethos alert the day before. The blank screen coming alive. The data moving faster than she had ever seen data move. And she thought about the choice she had made when she opened that blank document and started typing with shaking hands. "I documented everything," she told them. "Every alert, every timestamp, every data pattern. I have it all." She paused. "And I want to go on record officially with my name." The DOT officer across from her said, "That takes courage, Ms. Lopez." "It takes nothing," Amanda said quietly. A 13-year-old girl activated a dead woman's life's work from the middle seat of row 27 because a flight attendant kicked her in the shin. "The least I can do is sign my name." The stock of North Atlantic Holdings dropped 4.3% when the market opened. Victor Hargrove had been expecting it. What he had not expected was the statement from American Airlines released at 9:30 announcing that they were in preliminary discussions about voluntary adoption of the passenger equity charter. They had not been asked. They had not been pressured. They had read the room as David had said and made a calculation. And the calculation had landed on the right side. Whether it was fear or conscience or both, it was real and it was public. And it could not be walked back. Victor stood at his window on the 32nd floor and looked at the city and thought about page 31 of the Ethos case file. The meridian payments, the dates, the dollar amounts, the documented instruction to suppress. He thought about who else had known. He thought about how many meetings he had been in over the years where the subject had come up sideways. Not directly, never directly, but in the language that powerful people use when they want to make a thing happen without saying the thing out loud. He thought about a woman named Rachel Bennett, who had spent 12 years building a system to make that language visible, and a crash over Lake Michigan, and a morning some time ago when he had gotten a call that had not troubled him the way it should have. He turned away from the window. He sat down at his desk. He picked up his phone and dialed Stephen Reeves. "I need to know," he said when Stephen answered. "Everything about Meridian, about the crash, everything." He paused. "And I need a criminal defense attorney, not corporate counsel, criminal defense." Stephen was quiet for a long moment. "I'll make some calls." "Do it now," Victor said. David came upstairs and knocked on Zoe's open door. She was still at her desk. She turned when she heard him. She took one look at his face. The particular stillness of it, the way grief and something like relief were occupying the same space, and she knew before he said anything that whatever Jessica Hale had told him had something to do with her mother. "Dad?" she said. He came into the room and sat on the edge of her bed, which he had not done since the very early months after Rachel died, when he used to come in at night and sit there until she fell asleep. And sometimes she would wake up at 2 a.m., and he was still there, asleep himself, sitting upright with his back against the footboard, because he had not wanted to leave. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. Zoe turned her chair to face him fully. She put her feet on the floor. She braced herself the way she had learned to brace, not by stiffening, but by getting very still and very present. By putting herself completely in the moment so there was no space for the thing coming to knock her sideways. "The DOT case," David said. "It's connected to your mother's crash." The room was very quiet. "How connected?" Zoe said. David looked at her. His eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible if you knew what to look for. "Enough that they've opened a criminal investigation," he said. "The principal partner of Meridian, his name is Edward Malone. He appears in connection with 2 other federal cases. One of them involves falsified maintenance records on the aircraft your mother was flying." Zoe did not move. She felt the words land one at a time like stones dropped into deep water. She felt them sink. She felt the ripples they made. "You knew," she said. It was not an accusation. It was something closer to recognition. "I suspected," David said. "For a long time. I couldn't prove it. I didn't have enough." He looked at the bracelet on her wrist. "Ethos found what I couldn't." Zoe looked at the bracelet, too. She thought about her mother in the kitchen humming. She thought about hands on her face and "I love you all the way through." And the door she had walked through too quickly, not knowing it was the last time. She thought about time of grief, and her father's late-night phone calls, and the system he had rebuilt piece by piece in the quiet hours after she went to bed. She thought about a first-class seat, and a flight attendant's foot, and 43 seconds of video, and the way one thing leads to the next, if you let the truth run where it needs to go. She looked at her father. "What happens now?" she said. David was quiet for a long moment. "Now," he said, "we find out how far it goes." The name Edward Malone meant nothing to most people on the morning of the second day. By noon, it would mean everything. David had not slept. Zoe knew this the way you know things about people you love without being told. The particular quality of his silence at breakfast. The coffee cup he refilled twice without drinking. The way he kept his phone face up on the table with the screen never going dark. She sat across from him and ate toast, and did not ask questions, because she understood that some information has to be carried carefully before it can be put down. And her father was still carrying. At 7 a.m., he said, "I need you to stay home today." Zoe said, "I know. There are going to be people, press, probably, maybe others." "I know, Dad." He looked at her. "Are you okay?" She thought about it the way she always thought about it. Honestly. Specifically. Without the reflex comfort of, "I'm fine." "I'm something," she said. "I don't have the exact word yet." He almost smiled. "Your mother used to say that she needed a word that didn't exist yet." "I know," Zoe said softly. "She used to practice them on me." They sat with that for a moment, the warmth and the ache of it existing in the same breath, which was how everything felt now, which was maybe just what love looked like after loss. Then David's phone lit up. He looked at the screen. He stood. He was already moving toward the study before he finished reading. "That's Jessica," he said. "I have to take this." The door closed. Zoe finished her toast alone. Jessica Hale had been awake for 31 hours. She ran on the specific adrenaline that federal investigators develop over years of cases that start as one thing and become another. the fuel of a story that keeps rewriting its own ending. She had 3 agents in the field, 2 in legal, and 1 analyst who had been staring at the Meridian financial records since midnight, and had just called her with something she was not prepared for, but could not say, surprised her. "Tell me what you have," David said the moment he picked up. "Edward Malone," Jessica said. 58 years old, principal partner of Meridian Advisory Group since 2009. Before that, 14 years in aviation regulatory affairs. He had direct relationships with 4 FAA commissioners, 2 of whom have since retired, and 1 of whom is currently the subject of a separate ethics inquiry. She paused. He has been paid through various Meridian accounts and shell structures a combined total of $11.4 million over the past 6 years by 3 major carriers, including North Atlantic. The payments have one thing in common. They all fall within 90 days of a Rachel Bennett presentation to industry leadership. David was quiet. "She pitched Ethos 6 times, Jessica continued, to 6 different airline consortiums. Every time within 3 months, a Meridian advisory recommendation appeared recommending against bias infrastructure investment. Every time." Her voice was level but tight, like a wire under load. "She was being tracked, David. Every time she moved the needle, Malone moved the counterweight." David said, "And the crash? The aircraft that went down over Lake Michigan some time ago was serviced 11 days before the flight by a maintenance contractor whose certification was managed through a subsidiary of a company that Malone has a 15% equity stake in." Jessica stopped. "The maintenance log shows a standard sign-off. Our forensic team has been looking at the actual physical records since 5 a.m. this morning. The sign-off does not match the physical condition of the part that failed." The silence was long and absolute. "He killed her," David said. Jessica said, "We are building the case to prove it, formally, legally, completely." A pause. "But yes, we believe so." Upstairs, Zoe was sitting on her bed with the bracelet in her palm. She had slipped it off for the first time since the flight, and she was holding it the way you hold something you need to understand by feel. Turning it slowly, the silver warming against her skin. She was thinking about her mother's hands. Rachel had the hands of someone who worked with tools and ideas simultaneously. There were always ink marks, callous lines, the occasional small burn from soldering equipment she refused to let her lab assistants touch. She had built things, actual things, not just code, not just theory. Physical systems wired and tested and real, the way an architect builds something meant to stand. Ethos had stood. Zoe thought about the 6 presentations. 6 times her mother had walked into a room full of men with money and power and the specific kind of fear that powerful men have about systems that make their behavior visible. 6 times she had laid out the evidence, the design, the moral case for something that should have been obvious. 6 times she had left those rooms and gone home and kept building anyway, because Rachel Bennett was not a woman who needed permission to believe that truth mattered. And 6 times, Edward Malone had walked in after her and made sure the door stayed closed. Zoe put the bracelet back on. She pressed the oval once, just to feel the pulse. It came steady, present, alive, like a heartbeat that had not stopped. She thought, "Mom, he couldn't kill what you built." He tried. He failed. She thought, "We're gonna finish it." Jamal Brooks was in front of 3 cameras. Not metaphorically, literally 3. From 3 different networks in a rented conference room at a hotel near LAX that his mother had insisted he upgrade to because his childhood bedroom was, in her exact words, not a place for this kind of conversation. He had a lawyer beside him, A woman named Carla Finch, who had called him the night before, introduced herself as a civil rights attorney with 20 years of media cases and said she would represent him pro bono because some cases you take because you need to, not because you're paid to. The interviewer from CNN was asking him what he was thinking when he hit record. "I wasn't thinking," Jamal said. "I mean, I was thinking, but not the way people assume. I wasn't thinking about going viral. I wasn't thinking about impact or change or any of it. I was thinking about her." He stopped. About this little girl who had just been kicked, who stood up without making a sound, who was walking to the back of the plane with her backpack on and her book under her arm. And she was more composed than anyone I had ever seen. And I knew that if I didn't record it, if I let it happen in the dark, it would be exactly what it always is. Another thing that happened that nobody can prove. The interviewer said, "Do you feel responsible for what's come of it?" Jamal thought about it. "I feel like I did the one thing I was supposed to do," he said. "Everything else, that's Zoe. That's her father. That's her mother, honestly." I just pointed the camera. Edward Malone's attorney called the DOT at some time and said his client was prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation. Jessica Hale, who took the call personally, wrote 2 words on her notepad and circled them both. "He knows." She circled them again. Then she called David. "He's going to try to negotiate," she said. "He'll offer the carriers in exchange for reduced exposure on the crash." "Don't let him," David said. "I don't intend to," Jessica said. "But I need you to know that this is going to get public very fast. When Malone's name connects to the crash, and it will connect, probably within 24 hours, this becomes a different kind of story. Bigger than the flight. Bigger than the charter. David said it was always bigger than the flight." "Yes," Jessica said. But the world didn't know that yet. The press was outside, not a lot. 4 reporters and 2 camera operators, but enough that Zoe could see them from her bedroom window. They were standing on the public sidewalk, which they were allowed to do, and they were patient in the way the press is patient when they know the story isn't finished and they have nowhere else to be. Zoe watched them for a moment. Then she turned away and went to her desk and opened her laptop. She had an idea that had been forming since she woke up. Something specific. Something she needed to put into words before it dissolved back into feeling. She opened a blank document and started to type. She was not writing a statement. She was not writing for the press. She was writing a letter to Amanda Lopez, whose name she had found in Linda Park's follow-up article. The data analyst in Dallas who had documented everything, who had filed a letter to the FAA with her own name on it, who had said in a quote that Zoe had read 4 times, "The least I can do is sign my name." She wrote, "Dear Amanda, you don't know me, but I know what you did, and I want you to know that it matters." She stopped. She reread the sentence. She kept going. In a federal building in downtown Los Angeles, Edward Malone sat across from 2 DOT investigators and 1 FBI agent and his attorney and said, for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, that he had no direct knowledge of any maintenance irregularities on the aircraft that went down over Lake Michigan. The FBI agent placed a document on the table. It was a single page, a maintenance authorization form dated 11 days before the crash, with a signature that matched Malone's equity partner's name, and a physical condition assessment that did not match the forensic analysis completed that morning. Malone looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the document. "We'd like a short recess," the attorney said. "You have 5 minutes," the FBI agent said. In those 5 minutes, Edward Malone aged approximately 10 years. His attorney leaned close and spoke in a voice too low to carry across the room. But the content of what he said was visible in the way Malone's shoulders changed. The specific collapse of a man who has been constructing a wall for some time and has just been shown that the foundation was never solid. When they reconvened, Malone's attorney said, "My client would like to make a proffer." Jessica Hale, who was monitoring the session from an adjacent room, wrote one word on her notepad. Finally. The first person to call Zoe's personal cell phone that morning. Not the number that had been printed in news articles, but her actual number, which very few people had, was Margaret Hayes. Zoe answered on the second ring. "Margaret." "Good morning, sweetheart." Margaret's voice was exactly what it had been on the plane. Warm, direct, unhurried. The voice of a woman who had seen a great deal of the world and had made peace with most of it. "I saw the news this morning, all of it." "Which part?" "The charter, the investigation, the man they're looking at." A pause. "The part about your mother." Zoe closed her eyes. "Yeah." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly. Not the way you answer reporters, the real answer." "Okay. How are you holding up?" Zoe sat with the question. Outside her door, she could hear her father on another call. His voice low and controlled and relentless. Downstairs, the press was still on the sidewalk. Her phone had 47 unread messages. Her shin still ached. The bracelet was warm on her wrist. "I'm sad," she said. "I'm sad and I'm angry and I feel like something that was supposed to happen is happening. Like a thing that was held underwater is finally coming up." She stopped. "Is that strange?" "No," Margaret said immediately. "That's grief making room for something else. That's what happens when the truth starts moving. You don't stop being sad. You just get something to do with the sadness." Zoe opened her eyes. "My mom would have liked you." Margaret laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep. "I would have liked her right back. Everything I know about her, she sounds like someone who refused to waste a single day." "She was," Zoe said. "She really was." The press conference was not scheduled. David had not announced it. He had simply called Linda Park at 10:30 and said, "I'm going to make a statement outside my home at 11. If you want to be there, be there." Linda had been there in 20 minutes. By 11, there were 14 reporters outside. By 11:15, when David walked out the front door, there were cameras from every major network. He stood on his front steps without notes. He looked at the cameras for a moment, not nervous, not performing, just taking the measure of the room the way he always did before he spoke. Then he said, "My daughter is 13 years old. She boarded a flight some time ago with a valid first-class ticket. She was removed from her seat and physically kicked by a flight attendant who assumed she did not belong where she had every right to be. That incident set in motion a chain of events that has led to a federal criminal investigation, the signing of the passenger equity charter by 6 major carriers, and the opening of a case that I have been waiting some time for the law to be ready to hear." He paused. "My wife, Dr. Rachel Bennett, spent 12 years building a system designed to make bias in aviation impossible to ignore. She was killed before that system was finished. I finished it for her." He looked directly into the nearest camera. "Ethos is now active. It is licensed to North Atlantic Air and will be operational across 6 carriers within 60 days. It will monitor, document, and flag bias incidents in real time across their combined fleets. It cannot be bought off. It cannot be closed. It doesn't accept informal recommendations from advisory groups with financial conflicts of interest." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. My wife built something the industry spent years and millions of dollars trying to bury. They buried her instead. They did not bury what she built." A reporter called out, "Mr. Bennett, can you confirm that Edward Malone is cooperating with the federal investigation into your wife's crash?" David looked at the reporter. "I'll let the Department of Transportation speak to that. What I will say is that the truth about what happened to that aircraft is going to come out completely. I have been patient. I am done being patient." Another reporter, "What do you want people to take from this?" David was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that nobody had expected. Not the reporters, not the cameras, not Linda Park, who had been covering him for some time and thought she had the shape of him figured out. He said, "I want people to look at their kids. I want them to look at their kids and understand that the world their kids are going to inherit is built by what we refuse to accept today. My daughter sat in the back of that plane and activated a system that her dead mother designed. And she did it without flinching, and she did it right. She did everything right, and she's 13 years old." His voice caught, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, and then held. "I am very proud of my daughter." He walked back inside. Zoe had watched the press conference from her bedroom window. She had heard every word. When her father came back inside, she was waiting at the top of the stairs, and he looked up at her and she looked down at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because the moment didn't need words. Then she came down the stairs and walked to him and put her arms around him, the way she had not let herself do on the plane, the way she had been holding back since seat 3A, since the kick, since the long flight to the back of the cabin. With her chin up and her jaw set and her heart beating too fast, she held on and she felt him hold back, and she thought about her mother's hands on her face the last morning. "I love you all the way through." And she let herself cry, finally, completely. Not the contained kind, but the real kind. The kind that shakes you and empties you and makes room for what comes next. David held his daughter and said nothing because, and there was nothing to say that the holding didn't already say better. Edward Malone was formally arrested at some time. The charges included conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of federal safety records, and the charge that landed on the news with the specific weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be named. One count of negligent homicide in connection with the crash of a commercial aircraft, resulting in the death of Dr. Rachel Bennett and 211 other passengers and crew. When the news broke, Zoe was at her desk finishing her letter to Amanda Lopez. She saw the notification on her phone. She read the charges. She read them again. She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and breathed. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, the way her father had taught her. The same pattern she had used in row 27 with a bruised shin and a humming bracelet, and a grief that she had carried so long. It had become part of her posture. She thought, 211 people. She thought, their families have been waiting too. She thought, Mom, we got him. She picked up her phone. She finished the letter. She sent it. By mid-afternoon, the story had crossed every boundary the news cycle usually draws between a human interest piece and a federal investigation. It was no longer Flight 247. It was no longer even just Diane Foster. It was Ethos. It was Rachel Bennett. It was Edward Malone and $11.4 million in falsified maintenance records and 212 lives. It was the specific American story of a woman who built something true and powerful and was killed for it, and a husband who spent some time in the dark rebuilding what she left behind, and a daughter who carried it onto a plane and pressed a silver oval for 3 seconds and changed everything. Jamal Brooks gave 6 interviews and cried in one of them and did not apologize for it. Linda Park filed her 3rd story in some hours, and it was the best writing of her career. And she knew it while she was writing it, which almost never happens. Margaret Hayes got a phone call from her youngest daughter in Los Angeles, who had seen her name in the Post article and who said, "Mom, were you on that plane?" And Margaret had said, "Yes." And her daughter had said, "And you just held her hand?" And Margaret had said, "What else would you do?" Amanda Lopez got Zoe's letter at some time. She read it at her desk in Dallas. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop, put on her coat, and walked outside into the afternoon air and stood there for a while doing nothing except existing in the fact that she had done the right thing and it had mattered. That was all. Sometimes that was everything. Jessica Hale called David one final time that afternoon. The proffer was complete. Malone had given them 3 names. 2 executives at other carriers, one sitting FAA official in exchange for prosecutorial consideration on one of the lesser charges. The remaining charges stood. The case against him in connection with Rachel's crash was, in Jessica's words, airtight. "It's going to trial," she said. "No deal on the homicide charge." "Not from us." "Good," David said. "It's going to take time. These things always do." "I know," he said. "We have time." After he hung up, he sat in his study for a while. The photograph of Rachel was on the desk in front of him, the same one he had spoken to the night of the 11-minute call. He looked at it now without speaking. He looked at her laugh and her hands, and the way the light caught her face in that moment 3 years ago at some conference when she had been talking about something she loved, and someone had pointed a camera at exactly the right second. He thought about how she had always said, "Bias survives in the dark. You have to turn the lights on." He thought about a 13-year-old girl pressing a silver bracelet on her wrist at altitude in the middle seat between strangers alone and composed and completely certain of what she was doing. He thought, "You turn the lights on, Rachel." She turned the lights on. Zoe sat on the back porch as the light changed. She'd been quiet for most of the afternoon, not the concentrated quiet of strategy, not the sealed quiet of suppressed grief, but a different kind. The quiet that comes after. She had her book in her lap, Thurgood Marshall, still on page 148, which she had not moved past in 2 days, because everything had kept interrupting. But she wasn't reading. She was just sitting, feeling the warmth in the bracelet, watching the light shift. She thought about all of it in sequence, the way you do when something enormous has happened, and you need to walk it back to the beginning to understand how it fits. Seat 3A, the hand on her arm, the kick. The walk to row 27, the 3-second press, the triple pulse, Jamal and his camera, Margaret and her hand, her father in the boardroom, Victor Hargrove's pen moving across the charter, Edward Malone in a federal building with his attorney saying, "We'd like to make a proffer." 212 names waiting some time for someone to say them in the right room, and her mother somewhere in all of it. In the code, in the design, in the absolute refusal to build something false. Her mother was in all of it. She opened the book to page 148. She read the passage she had been interrupted from some time ago, the one about Thurgood Marshall, standing outside the courthouse on the morning of the case that everyone said could. She put it in her lap and looked at the sky, the particular blue of a late Los Angeles afternoon, deep and wide and without ceiling. She thought about the question she had asked her father in that back seat after everything began. What are we going to do with it? She thought about his answer. That depends on who's in the room. She thought about who it was, and then she thought about tomorrow, the trial that would come, the carriers that would implement Ethos, the passengers who would board planes and be treated with the dignity they had always deserved, the families of 212 people who would finally have a name for what had taken their loved ones, the world that would be shaped inch by inch, case by case, by what a woman had built and refused to let die. And she felt something she had not felt fully in some time. Not happiness, not exactly. Something more durable than happiness. Something that did not depend on any one morning going right, or any one person behaving well, or any single act of justice being enough. She felt like her mother's daughter, and Rachel Bennett's daughter sitting in the last light of an April afternoon with a silver bracelet on her wrist and a book in her lap, and a bruise fading on her shin understood clearly and completely what her mother had understood for 12 years and died knowing, that the truth does not ask permission, does not wait for convenience, does not disappear when powerful people try to bury it. It runs where it needs to go. It finds the cracks. It comes up. You just have to be brave enough to turn the lights on. Zoe Bennett was 13 years old, and she had done exactly that. And the world, all of it, every part of it that had been arranged to stay dark, would never be the same. In the quiet middle seat of row 27, a 13-year-old girl named Zoe Bennett taught the world one of the most powerful lessons any of us will ever learn. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to look away. When a flight attendant yanked her from her rightful seat and kicked her shin in front of strangers, Zoe didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't collapse. Instead, she stood with quiet dignity, pressed a silver bracelet on her wrist, and activated something far greater than revenge. She turned on the lights. What followed was a breathtaking reminder that truth, once given a clear path, becomes unstoppable. One small act of defiance, captured on a phone by a stranger who chose not to stay silent, rippled outward until it exposed years of hidden cruelty, dismantled powerful lies, and brought long-buried justice into the daylight. Zoe and her father didn't set out to destroy an airline. They simply refused to let darkness win. And in doing so, they showed us that real change doesn't begin in boardrooms or courtrooms. It begins the moment someone decides the pain of staying quiet is worse than the risk of speaking up. This story isn't just about aviation or bias. It's about every time you've been told you don't belong. Every time you've watched injustice and wondered if your voice would even matter. It does. Your courage, no matter how small or quiet, can become the switch that lights up the entire room. If Zoe's story moved you, if it stirred something deep inside your chest and made you want to stand a little straighter, then do what Jamal did that day. Don't stay silent. Drop a comment below and tell me, what is one moment in your life when choosing to speak up changed everything for you? Which part of this story hit you the hardest? And most importantly, whose lights are you going to help turn on today? If you're ready to hear more stories that remind us how powerful ordinary courage can be, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's keep shining light together. Your voice belongs here.